Hey folks, welcome to part 2 of this monster truck engine project. I can tell you already that there's going to be a part 3 since I will still be waiting on a few parts by the time I get this video posted up. Those parts that I mentioned are actually the head gaskets. With the short block assembled, I was able to measure my piston to deck height clearance and start throwing some numbers into a calculator to figure compression ratio. And while I was doing that, I figured out that I needed about an 80 thousandths head gasket to get the compression ratio that I wanted. Ultimately, what I was shooting for was right around a high 10, low 11 to 1. And that makes for, blown alcohol, good power without getting super finicky on the tune. Or so that's what I've been told. So I just jumped on the Summit Racing compression ratio calculator, filled out all the boxes that they require, all of the stuff that I knew, bore, stroke, cylinder combustion chamber volume, now the known piston to deck height clearance, filled out all the stuff that I knew, and then went ahead and just started plugging in different numbers of head gaskets that I know were made or available. And I just picked what came out closest to, a reasonable 11 to 1. Now that worked out pretty good. I figured at a 80 thousandths thick head gasket. Unfortunately, Summit did not have those in stock. So I reached out to SCE and talked to them about their Titan series gasket, their copper gasket. And they had the 80 thousandths head gaskets in stock. So I asked if I could buy them direct from them, but they said I had to go through a dealer. So back to Summit I went. I went ahead and ordered those through Summit. SCE said they had them in stock. Unfortunately, it took Summit 3 days to get them ordered from SCE. So the way it worked out with the weekend and whatnot, it will be the middle of next week before I actually see them, hopefully in my possession. Unfortunately, that is my second day back to work, so it will be the following weekend before I actually get to bolt these heads on. Is what it is. I have a lot of little things that I can work on this engine, so really an extra week waiting on gaskets is not going to slow me down a bit. In the last video, there was a little bit of, fitting parts, checking clearances, stuff like that. But really, for the most part, all it was just a bunch of assembly. Nuts and bolts, a little bit of lube. It all went together pretty smooth. This week, on the other hand, is kind of a different story altogether. I'm going to have to modify some parts that I have, build some new parts from raw material, a little bit of fabrication there. So hopefully it'll be, maybe a little bit more interesting than the last video was. But to start with, I'm actually going to mask this block off and go ahead and get some paint put on it. I'd already talked to my daughter, Allison, about what color we should paint the blocks. I didn't know if I wanted to do it gunmetal gray like the current block and like the truck is, or actually do them Ford blue. I think they would look really good blue. So, when I get kind of torn on a decision like that, I go ahead and throw it in her court and let her make that call. She usually does a pretty good job for me there. She took a little bit of time and said that gunmetal gray would be the way to go. I went to town, looked for my favorite spray bomb, a couple cans of that. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any in town. I do have some base clear here, so it looks like I'm going to be overkilling this a little bit, but it is what it is. It should look good when it's all done. That's what I'm going to work on right now, so let's get started. While I give that paint some time to dry, I'm going to go over some of these parts, what their function is, how I'm going to change them, and why I am actually changing them. Hopefully by the end of the video, this all makes sense. In the previous video, I had mentioned this crank drive hub and the lower blower pulley, which went on it. And I had said that there was more to that I would get to later. So here we are. And the more to that is this whole mess of parts right here. This is the timing cover. And obviously you can see this is not a typical 429, 460 timing cover. This is actually a custom billet piece built by DT Machine. And all of this incorporates into all of your lower blower drive and your fuel pump drive stuff. So I'm going to try and go over that and explain these pieces and how they're designed to work first. Now obviously this bolts onto the front of the block, and the crankshaft, snout of the crankshaft sticks out through this hole, and this is your front seal area here. Now this is actually the blower drive hub that comes with this kit. So we'll set this off to the side since that is something I am choosing to use. So this right here takes place of your typical spacer that goes on a 460 crank snout. That is what the seals on, and it pushes up against the lower timing gear. This pulley right here would bolt to this spacer, and now you have an accessory drive pulley to run stuff like your alternator. Next in line on the snout would be, this is actually the blower drive hub. It would slide on the crank snout next, double keyway like I mentioned in the previous video. And then your lower blower drive pulley bolts onto that. Next in line is the crank snout support mandrel. You can see this is the same bolt pattern as the blower drive hub and the blower pulley. And there's enough of the hub sticking out through that pulley there. This thing can register on it. You bolt everything together, basically sandwiching the pulley in this assembly. And you just keep stacking up. Then you have the crank support and the crank support bearing. So here's the bearing. This presses into this housing here, and the bearing slides over this mandrel. So with this pressed in here, sliding over the mandrel, you can see how this all stacks up. Now before you actually put this on, you have these spacers that fit in this timing cover here. You have 4 of those to go in each position on the timing cover. Then this crank support actually fits over, and this all ties it together. So what it's doing is basically you have so much stuff sticking out the front of this timing cover hanging on the end of the crank. And when you're driving a large supercharger, that's a lot of load. As the blower belt spins, it tries to go back to a circular shape, a true circle. You know, it's oblong running up to the blower itself, but as the RPM speed increases and the load of the blower also is pulling the snout up towards the blower. So what this crank support is doing is actually supporting the front of that crankshaft and helping that load as the belt is pulling up on the front of the crankshaft. Big block Ford is typically, it's kind of an Achilles heel having that little crank snout on there and having all of this load prying on the end of that crankshaft. That 1 3/8 snout is definitely not its strong suit. Also, as I had mentioned in the previous video, that's another reason I would keep that big industrial snout if I had the choice. Also with this setup here, this bolt pattern here is for the fuel pump. Your mechanical injection actually drives on the front of the camshaft. I will be getting into that more later, but that is what this pattern is for. And then another super cool thing about this billet cover is this is the tensioner, or your belt tensioner idler goes right here in this slot. So you can actually bolt your idler in this slot and then tension your blower belt. Now for what I'm going to change and what I have already changed. I like the crank support and I'm going to keep that, but I do want to shorten it up even more if possible. So we'll set this stuff out and go back to this crank hub, which I purchased for this project. You can see here that the length on this is just a hair longer than this spacer, and the diameter is the same for the seal. So this drive hub will go on the crankshaft, sealing in the front seal. That's not going to sit quite that far down in there. Obviously, I don't have a lower timing gear for this to sit on and hold it in the right position. But sitting right here, as you can see, it's already way shorter than this combination here. I'm hoping that once I get this installed, pull a few measurements, I'll have this spaced out with enough room to actually flip this pulley over upside down. As you can see, I will have to machine this register and the pulley, bigger diameter to fit around that blower drive hub. We should still end up with an accessory drive pulley, the blower drive pulley, a drive mandrel, and the crank support. And in the end, we'll be shortening it up by about 1.5 inches. So that's one modification. That is the plan as we go forward. Another modification has to do with the coolant passages. These coolant passages were not here when I bought this piece. The instructions with this part here, they say to tap the freeze plugs in the side of your block and then plumb the water, incoming water, into the block through the front frost plug holes. If you remember in the previous video, my block is hard blocked above those freeze plugs. So I can't, if I pipe into that location, no coolant's going to get through that area. So that is why I set this up in the mill and drilled and tapped these holes for Boss O-ring fittings. That way I can adapt plumbing and run a remote water pump. Another modification is I had to machine 1/4 inch off the back of this timing cover. And that is what I will go over next, because that is a whole different project all by itself. And this pretty well covers the timing cover and the blower drive stuff. So now on to motor plates. Those paint fumes must be getting to me a little bit. I completely spaced mentioning a really cool feature with this setup. Not only is it supporting the crankshaft, but this is also the mounting location for a hydraulic pump, which runs directly off the front of the crankshaft. And that is what is used for the hydraulic steering on pretty much any competitive style monster truck. So rather than an automotive belt-driven type power steering pump, most trucks actually run a gear-style hydraulic pump. And how that works is the pump itself bolts to these mounts here, and then in the drive mandrel, have this splined coupler here, which I will have to TIG weld into the mandrel itself. And then, as I mentioned, this is inside of the pulley there, centered in the bearing. Now with the pump bolted on right here, the input shaft of the pump is plugged directly into the splines on this coupler. So now I have a hydraulic pump that is driven one-to-one with the crankshaft. Some setups, some companies actually have like a Lovejoy coupler, and this part here is machined into the mandrel, and then they use the opposite side of the coupler and drive the pump that way. But no Lovejoy for me. It's going to be direct and TIG welded. That's the way this one's going to work. I did not want to miss this pump mounting detail because this is the exact same setup as what is currently on the truck now. The biggest difference being this is a kit that I purchased, and the one that is currently on the truck is all homemade stuff. Now, the reason I purchased a kit this time is because the stuff that is on the truck was extremely time consuming to build. And once I've done one, it's not that interesting to do more than one. I'm not a production shop. I just like to build one-off stuff. What I do also like to do is support people that support what we do. Anytime that a big block Ford guy is going to build cool parts like this, I'm all for trying them out. And the quality on this part right here is really, really good. I'm 100% happy with this purchase. As a matter of fact, I may buy another complete assembly from David just to put on the second engine. That way everything is loaded up, and if I ever have to swap engines quickly, I don't have to worry about swapping these parts back and forth between the two engines. Now we can get on to motor plates. Typically, a monster truck engine is mounted in the chassis using what is referred to as motor plates. At the front of the engine, you will have a plate that bolts to the front of the block, and then that plate will have mounting holes to bolt to tabs in the chassis. There's no rubber, no flex, it's just rigid mounted. Then at the back of the block, sandwiched between the block and the transmission, is what is referred to as a mid plate. Now that is how I have Midnight Panic set up. Sandwiched between the engine and transmission is a typical mid plate. It uses all of the bell housing bolts to sandwich that plate in place. And then there are 4 half-inch bolts that on each side. So a total of 8 half-inch bolts that hold that plate into the chassis. Now here is my front motor plate. And the reason I'm showing this is because it is different than most typical big block Ford front motor plates. Typically, a guy running a 460 or a big block Ford based engine will use these holes right here on the timing cover. So this is your water pump mounting holes here. Usually you're going to run an electric water pump if you're going to have a mid plate or a motor plate. These 5/16 bolts, you'll bolt the plate to it and then the plate will bolt to the chassis. I don't care for that setup myself because you have these really long bolts and the plate is, it's a good 2.5 inches away from the block that you're trying to support. So what I've done is set my front motor plate up to actually go between the block and the timing cover. So then, where the bolt is actually fastening to the block, you're just holding this plate a lot closer to the heavy portion that you're trying to support. That's just my theory on it. On top of that, not only are you just using these bolts here, you're using a good portion of these bolts in these locations, but I'm also catching other bolts. This is a bolt in the block. These two are in the heads. Same on this side. You have these three actually, that are in the head on that side of the engine. So I just think it's a stronger setup, but it does require a bit more work. That is why I had to machine 1/4 inch off the back of this new timing cover to make up for the 1/4 inch thickness of this front motor plate. Now I built this plate right here when I did the first engine that is currently in Midnight Panic. When I was doing that whole setup, I built 2 front motor plates because I knew I was going to have 2 engines. Well, now we're going to have 3 engines, at least 3 engines for the truck. The current front motor plate that is on the 547 is going to stay with that engine. This plate here I built at the same time, and I actually had planned on using this with the engine that I'm building right now, the one that we're assembling in this video. But I have a third engine coming along, and I thought now would be a good time to draw up a DXF file of this plate right here so I can build another front motor plate for the third engine, only this time I'm going to use the CNC router table. So that's what I'm going to do next, actually right now. I'm going to go ahead and sit down, draw this part up, and then go cut a piece out of 1/4 inch aluminum on the router table. Well, that plate turned out really pretty good. For anybody that's curious, my CNC router is a Shapeoko 5 Pro. And in previous videos, I have shown where I actually use an older version of PlasmaCam to draw up my parts, export those drawings as a DXF file, and then import them into the Carbide Create program. That is where you can convert it to a toolpath and then send it to the machine and let the router do all the work. It really does a pretty nice job on this aluminum for a CNC router. I've been pretty happy with that machine for sure. So now it's really convenient. I have a drawing of this motor plate. I did have a couple of holes that I had to make some minor adjustments to, but I've already made those adjustments in the drawing. So next time, if I need to cut one of these out, it should be spot on and fit really well. Now, the other convenient side of having this drawing, later on down the road, if a 1/4 inch 6061 motor plate proves to not be strong enough, I have a couple of options. I could order up a partial sheet of 7075 in 1/4 inch, whip one of those out and see if that is strong enough. Or if I wanted to, I could machine another 1/8 of an inch off the back of the timing cover and slap a piece of 3/8 on the table and whittle another one out and try that. I would imagine by the time you get to the point of 3/8 7075, if I'm destroying that, I need to look into other issues. Now the machine work isn't quite done yet on this plate. Prior to ordering the head gaskets, I had mocked up this head, had it set up on the deck of the block, and I knew inherently the head does not end up flush with the end of the block on the right hand side. Normally they always stick out the front, and if the head doesn't stick out past the front of the block, at least the head gasket does. So I have to machine a spot in here to make up for that. I actually had this head set up in the Bridgeport, and I had planned on facing the end of this head off. You can see I've measured from the front of the head to the front of the block is 56 thousandths of an inch that this head protrudes out past the block. I set it up in the mill, and I just decided that I really didn't like the setup. The head is almost too wide for my table on the mill. Here's one of my Blue Thunder heads for the 547, and you can see I'd actually done that. So this head, I machined that distance back so it sits flush with the front of the block. This head here, you can see there's a lot more surface that a guy has to machine off versus, just a few ribs. Ultimately, I decided I like the idea better of taking that material off the back of the plate. 56 thousandths in this location is not going to really affect the strength of the plate very much. So I slapped this plate on there actually when I was mocking up the head gaskets and made sure that was going to be a problem. That's why it is marked. This plate here, I need to bolt it on, mark it, set it up in the mill, and what I will do is machine 56 thousandths off the side of the plate, off the face of the plate, and then where the deck of the block and the head actually meet, I will actually make that slot about 75 thousandths deep, just to make sure if those head gaskets protrude out the front of that head and the block just a little bit, I'll have a little room. And there is our newly recessed area. I don't know if you can see it in the video at all, but I used a 1/4 inch ball nose end mill to put an extra 25 thousandths or so, 20 thousandths deeper groove right here where the head gasket might end up protruding more if it does. But the rest of this is right on the money at 56. I think there's still plenty of meat there. Should be good. And as you probably noticed in that last bit of time lapse, it's kind of a bummer when you do engine assembly in the machine room, because you got to bag up the engine, move it out of the way, do the machine work, and machine work is pretty messy sometimes. So then I had to stop and completely clean the room up again. But now we're back in business. Good to go. I can continue on with the engine. And unless I change my mind, I do believe the next step will be fuel pump drive. So as I mentioned, the mechanical fuel pump drives off the front of the camshaft. and it is a 3/8 hex on the fuel pump here. So you have to have some sort of drive on the front of the camshaft or the front of the timing gear to drive that fuel pump. Now, I've got quite a selection of different things I've collected over the years. This is one that I bought, it's brand new. I don't know how come I never used that one. I think mostly because I almost see this maybe as a wear item, this hex in here. So I set the 547 up with one of these. This is an off-the-shelf part. Anybody carries it that deals with mechanical fuel injection. Alky Digger, Good Vibrations, Enderly, all of those guys. I think this might actually be an Enderly part. I'm not 100% sure on that. But this is actually for a GM application. You can see this 3-bolt pattern here is the same as what holds the timing gear onto the camshaft on a big block or a small block Chevy. So this is like a $35 or $40 part. To use this, you have to build an adapter, something like this. So you have your 7/16 bolt that retains the upper gear onto the cam, and then this drive right here will bolt to that. And the reason that I'm not just going to use this one is it's a little bit thin. It doesn't reach out quite as far as I want. I believe this setup here is meant to use with this timing cover. And this timing cover is just a little bit, you know, it's not quite as tall here as the DT machine one that I'm using. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to build another one of these that is a little bit thicker this way. And I can bolt these to it. That way if this hex ever gets wonky, you know, it gets worn out, something happens here, I can buy a new one. I can carry a spare. And I guess that means I will be using the lathe, which means I will be throwing chips all over this room again. So I'm going to bag this motor up again, roll it out that set of doors again, and get to making some chips. On the plus side, once I get that stuff bolted to the front of the cam here and get that all sorted, I believe I will be able to actually put the front motor plate on, the timing cover on for good, and the oil pump drive rod, pickup tube, and the oil pan. You know, I might be waiting on those head gaskets yet. Now look at that shiny paint. Well, here we are. It's a new day. I got this adapter built last night. And since I had the material in the machine already, and I already had a mess going, I went ahead and built a second one. Since I will be assembling a second engine later down the road, I won't have to worry about building another one of these. But by the time I got 2 of these built, you know, machined, they're doing all the round work in the lathe and then setting them up in the milling machine to drill and tap this bolt pattern, it was probably about 3:45 to 4 this morning by the time I got home. So after a quick nap and a cup of coffee, here I am back at the shop. Pretty happy with how this all turned out. The back of this drive spud actually has a register on it that needs to fit in the register in the front of this to keep everything in line. So nice. That part is done. There's also a register on the back of this part that centers it on the timing gear. So all of that will drive and it won't get all wonky in there. Now, as far as fasteners this morning, this particular piece is designed to use either 12-point bolts or Allen head bolts. I had 12-point bolts on hand, but they were 1 inch long and I need 3/4 inch. So I set 2 of these up in the lathe and shortened them up just a touch. And the third bolt, I started with 1 1/4 inch bolt and left this little bit of a tip on it. And I'll show you what that's for. So with this piece, it's basically the washer that retains the gear onto the camshaft, as I had mentioned earlier. So with that piece in place and the bolt going through and holding it to the camshaft, then you're able to bolt this part on. Now, there's 2 locations to line up in each dowel. You can see you have the 3-bolt pattern here and then an extra hole. This extra hole is for the second dowel pin, and that will be the initial lineup. What I've got here is a set screw or a grub screw that will thread in to this hole right here, and it will thread in far enough that it will protrude past the back. Like so. That way you can actually put this on in place, torque the bolt, and this is all in line and it won't move. Everything's fastened and in place. Next, this part will go on, and this longer bolt with the tit on the end of it goes opposite of the grub screw. And as you can see, now we have basically 2 drive pins to make sure this part turns. The other 2 bolts just fasten as normal. Now, I got to thinking a little bit. I don't want that first grub screw to back out, maybe work its way loose or something. There's enough threads there that I'm going to shorten this, a second set screw. I'm going to shorten that up to where I can actually lock this first one in place. So I'll use this to retain the cam gear, get it all bolted in place, and then tighten up that first grub screw against the dowel pin in the end of the camshaft. Then I'll lock it in place with this one here and then assemble everything. So that's the plan after I clean this machine room again. I joke about having to clean this room up, but really it's a lot better than having to clean up the other side of the shop where I do the welding and fabrication. Heck, half the time I work over there with the doors wide open. It might be a little inconvenient here, but at least everything in here is just oil and chips. So it really works out to be a pretty clean place to assemble an engine like this. Well, today while off camera, I went ahead and used that copper mock-up head gasket. Got the head set on there, torqued it down to 50 foot-pounds. That was plenty good enough to seat everything down and make sure it's flat. I was able to double check my clearance on the front motor plate. And I was also able to measure for push rods. And it turns out I have a brand new set of 3/8 080 wall push rods. That should work. Look like they're the right length. I will double check that once I get the correct thickness head gaskets. Also today I went ahead and pressed this bearing into the crank support. So that part's all done. And I also got the blower drive hub pressed onto the crankshaft. This washer arrangement is temporary. I'm going to end up building a new washer for that. And last but not least, but the drive spud for the fuel pump worked out perfect. All of that fits really nice. Looks like it's going to work really good. So yeah, definitely gained some ground this week. I'd like to got more done, but I got everything accomplished that I was set out to do. So I cannot complain, not one bit. I'll bring you guys back next week and we'll get some head set on this thing and start looking into how this intake manifold is going to fit. Until then, thanks for watching and have a good one. Saying a lot already.